It was late on a warm summer night in Atlanta, the kind of night where the air seemed heavy with something unspoken. The city hummed with the usual mix of noise, cars rolling by, the faint bass of music drifting from one block to the next, the chatter of people who lingered outside gas stations and convenience stores long after midnight. Streetlights painted everything in a dull yellow glow, catching the shine of car hoods and the tired look in people's eyes. At one corner, a gas station buzzed under fluorescent lights, its pumps standing like tall, tired soldiers waiting for whoever pulled in. It was a place that didn't feel dangerous, but didn't feel safe either. Just one of those in-between spaces where the wrong moment could shift everything. On that night it looked ordinary. A handful of cars were parked at the pumps, drivers going through the motions, swiping cards, filling tanks, grabbing cigarettes and snacks from the small shop inside. The smell of gasoline mixed with fried food from the takeout spot next door. For anyone watching, nothing seemed out of place. But that night would be remembered for the way something normal turned into a storm in seconds. There was a young black woman at the center of it. To anyone looking, she seemed like any other customer, moving with a quiet confidence that could be mistaken for calm. She wore simple clothes, carried herself without showing much emotion, and blended into the late-night rhythm of the city. Nobody around her could guess the truth about who she was or what kind of work she did. They only saw what she let them see. Just another woman out on a late-night stop. But power has a way of testing people in places like this. And sometimes, those who carry authority forget the line between protection and control. That night, 2 local cops on patrol rolled into the gas station lot. Their cruiser pulled up fast, lights foam, licking for just a second before shutting off. They weren't responding to a call. They were just circling, watching, moving through the streets like they owned them. The kind of presence that made people stiffen up, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. The 2 officers had been partners for a while. They knew the rhythm of each other's words, the way the other moved. They had their own unspoken rules, their own way of deciding who belonged where and what kind of behavior looked suspicious. And in their eyes, suspicion often looked like skin color, posture, and attitude. They carried a certain power, the kind that came from years of being feared more than being respected. They didn't see people as individuals as much as they saw categories, troublemakers, outsiders, ones to keep an eye on. Inside their car, the talk was casual at first. Boredom mixed with a hunger for something to break the night. They watched the pumps, scanning for anyone who looked like they didn't fit the picture in their heads. And then they noticed her, standing there, alone, pumping gas without much of a glance in their direction. That quiet self-assurance she carried didn't register as normal to them. It read as attitude, maybe defiance. It didn't matter that she wasn't doing anything unusual. In their eyes, not looking afraid was sometimes enough to trigger suspicion. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just anyone. She wasn't powerless, even though they assumed she was. She was trained to watch, to read situations, to blend in. She lived in a world where information could save lives, where every move had meaning, and where silence was sometimes louder than words. But she also knew the risk of being black in moments like this, of being a woman alone at night with uniforms watching her like prey. It didn't matter what her real identity was. Not yet. All that mattered in that second was survival. The gas station lights buzzed above her head, and in that glow, she looked almost untouchable. But her heart was aware of every detail, the sound of their car doors opening, the crunch of boots on pavement, the way their voices carried before they even reached her. She didn't flinch, but she felt the weight of something coming. There was history behind that moment, a long shadow of encounters where power tilted too far and respect disappeared. She wasn't the only one with a life before that night. The 2 officers each carried their own stories, their own justifications for how they moved through the world. One of them had been raised in a family where authority was never questioned, where the uniform was sacred and the badge was proof of being above others. The other had grown up quiet, unnoticed, and found in the Force a way to matter, a way to hold power in a world that had ignored him. Together, they carried their frustrations, their pride, and their sense of control, like weapons sharper than the ones on their belts. Yet beneath their normal patrol, there was something restless, a need to prove something to themselves or to each other. Nights like this, when nothing big happened, could stir up a hunger for conflict. And sometimes, all it took was the sight of someone who didn't bow their head quickly enough. The woman, calm on the outside, knew better than to underestimate what could happen. She had seen too many stories end badly. The headlines, the news reports, the names people marched for, all of them sat in the back of her mind like ghosts. But she also carried something none of them expected. A truth she had been forced to protect with silence. A role that gave her power they couldn't imagine. The air at that gas station was thick with what nobody was saying. Customers moved around quietly, aware but unwilling to step into the tension. A couple sitting in a car kept their eyes down. A man walking out of the store pulled his hood tighter and kept moving. Everyone could feel it, the kind of shift that made the night suddenly dangerous. None of them knew the real storm hadn't even started yet. The woman stood there, gas pump in hand, her expression unreadable. The two officers walked closer, one already resting his hand near his belt, the other smirking like he already knew how this would go. They believed they had control of the story. But what they didn't know was that control could flip in an instant. And when it did, nothing about this night would ever be forgotten. The woman stood still at the gas pump as the two officers approached, their movements sharp, calculated, as if the space already belonged to them. The night had gone quiet in her mind, every detail magnified, the metallic click of the nozzle as she returned it to the pump, the faint hum of the lights above, the crunch of gravel beneath heavy boots. She knew these sounds well. She'd learned to focus on them in moments of danger, to anchor herself when adrenaline threatened to overwhelm her. Yet behind her calm exterior, her chest tightened. She could feel the weight of their eyes pressing against her, demanding submission without a word. One of the officers, the taller one, carried himself with a swagger that came from years of not being challenged. His face was set in a half-smirk, the kind that wasn't quite a smile but more of a warning. He'd been on the force long enough to see fear as a kind of reward. And what he saw in her, silence, composure, the absence of fear, unsettled him. To him, it wasn't normal. It wasn't how people like her were supposed to act. The other officer, younger but harder in his tone, already had his hand hovering near his holster, more from habit than necessity. He carried his authority like a shield, convinced that danger could appear at any moment and that it was his job to strike before it did. She glanced at them briefly, meeting their eyes, then turned back to close her gas cap. It was a simple act, but to them it felt like dismissal, a refusal to give them the acknowledgement they demanded. That, more than anything, lit the first spark. "Hey!" the taller one called out, his voice sharp and cutting through the night air. "What are you doing out here?" Her reply was even, measured. "Getting gas, same as anyone else." The younger officer shifted his stance, squaring his shoulders. "Don't get smart. This isn't about gas. You look like you're up to something." The words were absurd, but absurdity had never protected anyone in situations like this. She knew better than to argue, but she also knew that silence could be twisted into defiance. She was caught in the impossible balance every black person had been forced to live with at one time or another. Too quiet meant suspicious. Too assertive meant threatening. "I'm just getting gas," she repeated, her tone steady, calm enough to sound harmless, but firm enough to remind herself she wasn't weak. The taller one moved closer, closing the space between them, his shadow stretching long across the concrete. His partner followed, the two of them circling like wolves, their presence making it harder for her to breathe. They asked questions that didn't make sense. Where was she coming from? Where was she going? What did she have in her car? Each question dripped with accusation, as if the answers didn't matter, as if guilt was already written on her skin. Inside her, the storm churned. She wanted to tell them who she really was, the badge that lay hidden in her bag, the life she lived undercover, the cases she had worked that made her more of a protector than they would ever know. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she was sure it was her only way out. Her cover wasn't just about her job. It was about her safety, her survival, and the fragile trust the Bureau had in her ability to stay invisible. Still, she felt something shift inside her. A mix of anger and fear, but also a kind of quiet defiance. She wasn't a child. She wasn't powerless. And she was tired. Tired of being questioned for existing. Tired of being treated like a problem. The tension bled into the people around them. The man sitting in his car at the far pump rolled his window up, turning his music low. A woman walking into the store slowed down, glancing nervously at the unfolding scene before slipping quickly inside. Everyone knew better than to intervene. They'd seen enough news stories to know how quickly things like this could turn bloody. The younger officer stepped closer, lowering his voice, his words meant only for her. "You think you're slick? Standing here like you don't care. We see through that." His eyes narrowed, scanning her car. "Open the trunk." Her pulse quickened, but she forced her voice to stay steady. "Why?" "Because I told you to," he shot back, his hand resting heavier on his belt now, the gesture deliberate. It was more than a request. It was a demand to submit. She could feel the danger growing, the invisible clock ticking towards something irreversible. In the back of her mind, she thought of the other pressures in her life, the weight she carried long before this night, the job that never let her breathe, the faces of informants she had spoken to, people whose lives depended on her silence. The Bureau had warned her about exposure, about how fragile her cover was. But the Bureau hadn't warned her about this, the way her skin, her gender, her very presence could turn an ordinary night into a battlefield. The taller officer circled to the other side of her car, running his flashlight along the windows, peering in as though looking for proof of his suspicion. His smirk deepened when he saw her watching him. "What's in there? Drugs? Stolen goods?" he asked, his tone mocking. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Any response would be fuel for their fire. The younger one leaned in closer, his voice sharper now. "Don't play games. You want this to get worse?" She could feel her hands trembling slightly, though she kept them still at her sides. She'd been trained to handle interrogation, to withstand pressure, to hold her ground. But training was different when the threat wasn't a criminal, but the very people who claimed to uphold the law. The hypocrisy cut deeper than anything else. Her mind flashed to the stories of others, names etched in memory, names turned into chants at protests, names she swore she'd never become. She thought of her mother, who had always told her to be careful, to be invisible, because no matter what title or achievement she carried, the world would still see her as a target. The cops weren't just performing their authority. They were feeding off it, pushing each other to go further. Every time one stepped closer, the other matched it. Every glare, every sharp word was a dare to the other to push harder. There was ego here, a need to prove dominance not only to her, but to each other. For the woman, the unease shifted into a dangerous calm. She weighed her options carefully. If she revealed herself now, the situation might explode. If she stayed silent, it might anyway. The tightrope between survival and exposure stretched thinner by the second. Behind her composure, her thoughts raced. They didn't know her history, the missions where she'd worn disguises, the lies she had told to gather truths, the men she had stared down who were far more dangerous than these two. They didn't know the nights she had gone home and stared in the mirror, questioning who she had become in the process. They didn't know how heavy the badge in her bag felt, how it was both a shield and a trap. The younger officer reached for her door handle, testing if it was locked. She stepped forward quickly, blocking him, her voice sharper now. "Don't touch my car." That single sentence was enough. His face darkened, his jaw tightened. The taller one chuckled low under his breath, as if enjoying the game. The younger one took a step back, not retreating but preparing, his body tense. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about control. It was about the quiet war between power and dignity, the unspoken battle that had been fought for generations. The gas station had turned into an arena, its buzzing lights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The storm had not broken yet, but everyone could feel it building. Each word sharper, each stare colder, each second bringing them closer to the moment when something would snap. The woman knew she was standing at the edge of it, and she knew that the choices she made in the next few minutes could decide not only her fate, but theirs too. The moment broke faster than anyone expected. 1 second, the night was a taut wire of silence, stretched to the point of snapping, and the next, the sound of a raised voice cut through it like glass shattering. The younger officer had yanked the handle of her car door again, ignoring her warning, and this time he pulled harder. She stepped in front of him, her voice sharper than it had been all night. "I said, don't touch my car." It was the refusal he couldn't stomach. His face twisted, his hand sliding instinctively toward the weapon at his side. Not pulling it yet, but close enough that the threat hung thick in the air. His partner, the taller one, barked out a laugh, but it was hollow, the kind that masked nerves. They were both teetering on a line now, and even they knew it. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The air around her felt heavy, buzzing with the fluorescent lights and the gas pumps clicking as they reset for the next customer. The world shrank to this circle of cracked pavement, 3 bodies locked in a silent standoff. She thought of revealing the badge in her bag, ending this with the truth. But something inside her froze. Would they even believe her? Or would they see it as a challenge to their authority, an insult too deep to let go? The younger officer snapped first. "Step back," he barked, his hand gripping his weapon. The words weren't a request, they were a command. He was shaking slightly, adrenaline coursing through him, fear tangled with anger. He had convinced himself she was a threat, even though she hadn't moved against him. It was easier to believe that than to face the truth, that he was out of control. Her hands went up slowly, a gesture she hated, one that felt like surrender but might buy her a breath more time. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice low, steady. "You don't want to do this." But reason couldn't reach them. Their pride had swallowed it whole. The taller officer moved closer, his smirk gone now, his voice low and sharp. "You think you can tell us what we want to do?" His words dripped with resentment. He wanted her to bend, to show fear, to give him proof of the power he believed was his. For a split second, all 3 stood frozen. The sound of a car door slamming somewhere across the lot echoed like a gunshot. The younger officer flinked, and that was enough. His weapon cleared the holster, glinting in the harsh lights, pointed square at her chest. Time fractured. She could see every detail, the sweat along his temple, the tremor in his hand, the way his partner's eyes widened in a flicker of doubt. She could taste the metal in the air, the bitter scent of gasoline filling her lungs. Her own body surged with adrenaline, training flooding her muscles. She didn't think. She moved. Her hand shot into her bag, pulling out the badge she had promised herself she wouldn't reveal unless it was her last resort. She thrust it forward, her voice finally breaking the silence with a scream. "FBI! Put the weapon down!" For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The badge gleamed in the harsh light, undeniable. The officers froze, caught between disbelief and rage. The younger one's hand shook harder now, the gun still leveled at her chest. His face twisted, not with relief, but with something darker. Panic, humiliation, the realization that the person he'd cornered wasn't powerless. The taller officer grabbed his partner's arm, trying to steady him. "Wait," he muttered, his voice suddenly uncertain. But the younger one couldn't hear it. His pride had cracked wide open, and the fear of losing control consumed him. Her voice cut through again, sharp and commanding, the training in her tone undeniable. "Drop it now!" But instead of lowering the weapon, his finger twitched. The sound exploded through the night, the gunshot tearing the silence apart, echoing off concrete and steel. She felt the rush of air, the searing burn as the bullet tore past her shoulder so close it ripped through her sleeve. The world blurred for a moment, sound collapsing into a ringing hum in her ears. Chaos erupted. Customers screamed and ducked, some sprinting away from the pumps. The woman staggered back, her badge still in hand, her other hand clutching the burning line of pain where the bullet had grazed her. Her eyes locked on the younger officer's face, his expression a mixture of shock and horror at what he had just done. The taller officer cursed under his breath, grabbing his partner's arm and yanking the gun downward. "What the hell did you do?" he shouted, his voice breaking, no longer steady, no longer mocking. Panic dripped through every word. The younger one's chest heaved, his knuckles white around the grip of his weapon. She moved. I thought—" He couldn't finish. The excuse sounded weak even to him. Blood soaked through the woman's sleeve, but she didn't falter. Her voice rose, commanding and furious. "Drop the weapon! Now!" The authority in her tone hit harder than the badge itself. It was the sound of someone who had faced men like them before, someone who carried the law in a way they had only pretended to. The taller officer's hand shook as he finally pulled his partner's weapon down. "Jesus, man, she's FBI, she's one of us." But the words didn't land like they should have. They weren't relief, they weren't comfort, they were accusation. They knew in that moment their careers, their lives, had just changed. One gunshot had drawn a line they couldn't cross back over. The younger officer stumbled back, his voice breaking. "We can fix this. Nobody has to know. We just—" The woman's eyes blazed, the pain in her arm nothing compared to the fury in her chest. "You fired on a federal agent," she spat, her words heavy, final. The air between them was thick with panic. The taller officer looked around wildly, as if the blinking security cameras on the corners of the gas station hadn't already captured everything. The younger one's breathing came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting, searching for a way out of the reality he had created. For her, the moment stretched long and unbearable. She thought of how easily she could have been another name on a protest sign, another headline about an altercation gone wrong. She thought of her mother, her family, the countless times she had swallowed her pride to survive. And now, standing with blood soaking through her sleeve, she realized just how close she had come. The aftermath was raw, chaotic. A man inside the store dialed 911 with shaking hands. A woman crouched behind her car, whispering prayers under her breath. The younger officer finally dropped his gun, his voice breaking into a panicked whisper, "I didn't mean to." But no one cared about meaning anymore. The taller one's face had gone pale, his smirk long gone, his authority stripped bare. "We're screwed," he muttered, almost to himself. "We're so screwed." And standing in the center of it all, the woman straightened despite the pain, her badge still clenched in her blood-stained hand. She wasn't just a victim, she wasn't just a target. She was proof that the line between law and lawlessness could collapse in an instant, and when it did, the ones who claimed to protect were no different from the ones they hunted. The chaos didn't fade quickly. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each second. The officers stood frozen, their faces pale, their futures unraveling before their eyes. And she, breathing hard but unbroken, stared them down with a look they would never forget. The sirens arrived fast, their wails piercing through the heavy silence that had fallen over the gas station, and blue and red lights washed across the cracked pavement, illuminating faces drained of color, the streaks of blood on her sleeve, and the two officers who suddenly looked smaller than they ever had in uniform. In those blinding flashes, everything that had been hidden, pride, anger, fear, was stripped bare. The younger officer stood frozen, his gun now lying on the ground where he had dropped it, his eyes wide and glassy. His breathing came in short bursts, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning in his own panic. He whispered the same line over and over, more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." But intent no longer mattered. The shot had been fired, the wound was real, and the weight of what he had done pressed down on him heavier than the night air. His partner tried to hold it together, barking half-formed sentences, his voice cracking under the pressure. "It was a mistake. She moved for... He thought she had a weapon. You saw that, right? Somebody saw that?" His words didn't land the way he wanted them to. They hung in the air, desperate and hollow. A man already rewriting a story he knew no one would believe. The woman stood tall, despite the pain burning through her arm. Her bloodied sleeve clung to her skin, her breath uneven, but her stare never wavered. She didn't speak, not yet. She didn't need to. Every second of silence was its own accusation, a reminder that the truth of what happened couldn't be twisted into something clean. The badge in her hand was more powerful than any words. It gleamed under the flashing lights, proof that she was not what they thought, that she carried authority far greater than theirs. Other officers swarmed the scene, some rushing toward her, others pinning their eyes on the two who had caused it all. The look on their faces shifted quickly from confusion to horror as they pieced together the 6 Twain, 2 local cops, a wounded woman, and the unmistakable badge of the FBI. The younger officer started to crumble. His body trembled as his hands went to his face, as if he could hide from what he had done. His partner kept whispering urgently, leaning close, "Stick to the story, stick to the story. She moved. You thought she had a gun. We say that, we stay together." But even as he said it, his voice shook with the knowledge that the cameras at the station had seen it all, that their story was already falling apart before it began. In the hours that followed, the scene turned into something between a crime scene and a circus. Flashing lights painted the neighborhood, drawing a crowd of bystanders who whispered and recorded on their phones. News vans showed up before dawn, reporters hungry for a headline that carried all the elements of a storm: race, authority, violence, and betrayal. The FBI wasted no time. Agents filled the gas station lot, their suits sharp under the harsh lights, their expressions hard as stone. They moved with precision, their questions cutting straight to the truth. The woman was ushered into an ambulance, but even from the stretcher, she kept her eyes locked on the men who had cornered her hours earlier. Her silence was louder than their protests. In the holding rooms, the younger officer broke quickly. Guilt clawed at him, his face pale, his words stumbling as he tried to explain what he couldn't justify. "She moved. I swear I thought, if I'd known..." His sentences never ended, always collapsing into themselves. He tried to cling to the idea that fear had driven him, not malice, but the look in the investigator's eyes told him they weren't buying it. The taller officer fought harder, his pride refusing to let go. He leaned into denial, into justification. We had cause. She was acting suspicious. Her hands weren't visible. We can't be expected to know who's who at 2 a.m. But beneath the surface, even he knew his words were weak. The uniform that had once given him authority now felt like a costume stripped of meaning. Every sentence he spoke sounded less like truth and more like desperation. For the woman, the aftermath was a storm of emotions she struggled to contain. In the quiet of the hospital room, away from the flashing lights and the chaos, the weight of it pressed down. She thought of how close she had come to dying, how her name might have joined the list of others spoken in marches and vigils. The thought made her stomach twist, not just from fear, but from rage. She had dedicated her life to fighting crime, to uncovering truths hidden in shadows. Yet even her badge hadn't protected her from the reality of what it meant to be black, and a woman in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Her family's voices echoed in her head, her mother warning her that no matter what she achieved, she would always have to fight to be seen as an equal. Her father's quiet pride when she joined the bureau, his belief that she could change things from the inside. That pride now felt fragile, as if this night had cracked it in half. The community reacted with fury and exhaustion all at once. Word spread fast. 2 cops had threatened and shot at a black woman who turned out to be an undercover FBI agent. The story became more than just one incident. It became a mirror of a deeper truth, proof of something people had been shouting for years. Protests erupted in front of the police station, signs raised with words that demanded justice, demanded change. Some shouted her name, already lifting her into a symbol of survival and resistance. Others asked the same haunting question. If she hadn't been FBI, would she have survived at all? The department scrambled to control the fire. Press conferences were held, the chief standing stiff before cameras, insisting that an investigation was underway. He spoke of procedural mistakes, of tragic misunderstandings, words so rehearsed they felt empty. The public wasn't fooled. They saw the fear in his eyes, the cracks in his composure. This wasn't just about 2 officers. It was about a system, a culture, a wound that had been bleeding long before this night. For the officers' families, the fallout was brutal. The younger one's wife sat alone in their kitchen, staring at the headlines, wondering how she would explain to their children why their father was suddenly painted as a monster. The taller one's parents spoke in hushed tones, clinging to the idea that their son had only done what he was trained to do. But even among their closest friends, support was shaky. People whispered about the footage, about how clear it was, about how hard it would be to defend. Inside the bureau, the woman's colleagues closed ranks around her. They spoke quietly of her bravery, of how she had held her ground even when the threat came from those wearing the same uniform. Yet she felt no pride in their words. What lingered instead was the sharp, bitter truth. She had survived not because of justice, but despite it. The weight of it didn't fade. Nights stretched long and restless. She replayed the sound of the gunshot over and over in her head, the split second when everything could have ended. Sometimes she woke up gasping, hand clutching her chest, as if expecting the bullet to finally find its mark. And yet, in the midst of it all, she found a strange strength. Her survival wasn't clean or triumphant. It was messy, painful and raw. But it was survival nonetheless. And as the community rallied, as voices grew louder demanding accountability, she realized her story wasn't just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless under the gaze of authority, everyone who had ever been told to bow their head and stay silent. The officers, once untouchable in their authority, now sat behind bars of their own making. Not physical ones, not yet, but the kind built from guilt, shame, and the knowledge that the world had seen their faces, their actions. They could no longer hide behind badges that had once shielded them. Their names were whispered with contempt, their reputations shattered beyond repair. And the gas station, once just another late-night stop, became a landmark of sorts. People pointed it out as the place where the lie cracked open, where a woman stood her ground and lived to tell the story. The neon buzz of its lights would never again feel ordinary. The aftermath didn't bring easy closure. It rarely does. Instead, it left behind scars. On her body, on their lives, on a community already carrying too many wounds. But it also left behind truth, undeniable and sharp as glass. And for many, that truth was enough to spark something that could not be silenced again. By the time the dust settled, the gas station where it all began had become a symbol, not just of one reckless night, but of the fragile and explosive tensions that sit just beneath the surface of American life. The footage of two officers surrounding a black woman at the pumps, their hands twitching toward their weapons, their voices raised with thinly veiled threat, replayed across every television screen in the country, What no one knew in those heated first minutes, what even the officers themselves didn't realize, was that the woman they were barking at wasn't just any citizen. She was an undercover FBI agent. The revelation struck like a thunderclap. For the officers, it meant their authority had been turned against them. The balance of power shifted in an instant. They had believed they were the ones in control, but in reality, they had walked into a trap of their own making. What followed wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. In the immediate aftermath, the department scrambled to contain the fallout. Official statements were vague, hiding behind ongoing investigations and misunderstandings. But the truth had already spilled into the public domain. The woman's calm but searing voice as she identified herself as federal law enforcement was caught on a body camera, her words slicing through their aggressive commands. People who watched the video didn't just see a standoff. They saw fear, arrogance, and the raw power imbalance between citizens and those sworn to protect them. The two officers faced suspension first, then mounting calls for termination, and finally, criminal charges. The legal system, which so often turned its gaze away when misconduct came to light, couldn't ignore this case. The FBI agent's testimony carried too much weight. The world was watching, waiting to see if accountability was possible. For once, it seemed that the shield of the badge wasn't impenetrable. The courtroom became a battleground. The defense argued stress, confusion, and miscommunication. They painted the officers as men overwhelmed in a tense situation. But the prosecution countered with precision. The repeated escalation, the unnecessary threats, the refusal to de-escalate even after the woman clearly complied. Their words cut deeper because the evidence was undeniable. The verdict came after weeks of testimony, and though not as harsh as many had hoped, it marked a rare moment of accountability. One officer lost his career, stripped of his badge for good. The other, found guilty of misconduct, faced probation and mandatory training. Neither walked away unscathed, and neither returned to the position of unquestioned authority they had once abused. For the FBI agent, the ordeal left scars deeper than headlines could capture. She had spent years moving quietly, blending into places where secrets were exchanged in whispers. But this moment, this near brush with death at the hands of those who should have recognized her authority, changed her. She spoke publicly for the first time after the trial, her voice measured but heavy with the weight of truth. "I wasn't just a black woman to them," she said. "I was a target. My badge didn't matter. My training didn't matter. In that moment, my life could have ended over nothing." Her words haunted people because they were not just her story. They echoed the reality of countless others whose names never reached the news. The broader community fractured under the pressure of the case. Some rallied behind the officers, insisting they were being made scapegoats in a political storm. Others, far larger in number, saw the trial as a chance to demand long overdue change. Protests rose, voices carried through the streets, not just about this one gas station, this one woman, or these two officers, but about a system where fear and prejudice shaped every interaction. What lingered most was the uneasy recognition of how fragile justice really is. The case forced uncomfortable conversations at dinner tables, in classrooms, and in police departments themselves. Questions that had been ignored for too long were dragged into the open. Why does authority so often tilt into abuse? Why does race dictate the script before a word is even spoken? And how many near misses never make it into the light? The crime at the gas station was never about robbery or murder in the traditional sense. It was about power, how it's used, how it's abused, and what happens when it's challenged. The officers thought they held it absolutely. They believed their word, their threat, and their weapons gave them dominance. But in the end, their control crumbled the moment truth entered the frame. In reflecting on this story, it becomes clear that justice is never clean. The FBI agent survived, but survival came with a cost. She became a symbol when all she had wanted was to do her job quietly, away from cameras and headlines. The officers lost their positions, but the system that had shaped them The culture of suspicion, the unspoken permission to intimidate, remains stubborn, alive in other encounters across the country. The societal impact rippled outward, beyond the courtroom, beyond the city itself. It forced the question of morality, not just within law enforcement, but in all human behavior. How do we handle power when we have it? Do we use it to protect or to control? The gas station became a mirror, showing the darkest side of authority, but also hinting at the possibility of accountability, however fragile it may be. Justice in the end was partial. It always is. Lives were changed forever. 2 men stripped of the future they once counted on. A woman carrying a wound that no badge or verdict could heal, and a community left both shaken and awakened. The conclusion of this story isn't tidy because life never is. It leaves us with more questions than answers, forcing us to look inward at the systems we build, the prejudices we carry, and the ways we choose to see one another. And maybe that is the true ending, that nothing ends at all. The night at the gas station lives on, replayed in memory and media, a reminder that every small moment of power, every decision made in fear or arrogance, can ripple into something far larger than anyone imagined. It leaves us with the uneasy truth that justice is not just a verdict, but a constant fight, a fragile pursuit, and that behind every headline is a human being whose life has been rewritten forever.